Sign the papers, Elena, or I'll have security drag you out in your pajamas. Elena Vasquez stood in the marble foyer of what had been her home for 12 years, watching her husband of 15 years hold out a clipboard with the cold efficiency of a stranger. Behind him, 3 security guards shifted uncomfortably, their eyes fixed on anything but her face. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, she could see neighbors gathering on their perfectly manicured lawns, phones raised, recording her humiliation in real time. The eviction is legal, Robert continued, his voice echoing off the vaulted ceilings she'd personally selected during the renovation. You have 30 minutes to pack essentials. Everything else stays. Elena's hands trembled as she stared at the documents. Eviction notice. Restraining order. Dissolution of shared assets. Her signature line waited at the bottom, next to Robert's already confident scrawl. The man who'd whispered promises in her ear every morning for over a decade now wouldn't even meet her eyes. Where am I supposed to go? She whispered. That's no longer my concern. Robert checked his Rolex, the one she'd given him for their 10th anniversary, paid for with her inheritance from her grandmother's estate. Stephanie will be moving in this afternoon. The baby needs stability. The words hit like physical blows. Stephanie, 24 years old, blonde, currently 6 months pregnant with what Robert claimed was his child. The woman he'd been seeing for 8 months, while Elena had been working 60-hour weeks to save their struggling tech company from bankruptcy. Elena looked around the mansion one final time. Every detail bore her fingerprints. The custom Italian marble she'd sourced personally. The smart home system she designed and implemented. The art collection she'd curated over years of international business trips. Even the security system currently being used to remove her, she'd installed it after the break-ins 2 years ago. I need my laptop, she said quietly. Personal items only. The computer belongs to the company. It has my family photos. Robert's jaw tightened. You have 15 minutes now. Don't make this harder than it needs to be. Elena nodded slowly, then walked upstairs to their bedroom. She packed one suitcase with clothes, toiletries, and jewelry. Then she grabbed 2 things she'd hidden months ago, a USB drive from behind her prescription bottles and a sealed envelope from the bedroom safe. Downstairs, she could hear Stephanie's laughter echoing from the kitchen. The woman was already here, already making herself at home, probably running her hands over the granite countertops Elena had spent weeks selecting. When Elena returned to the foyer, Robert was pacing impatiently. Finally. Sign here, here, and here. He thrust the clipboard at her again. Elena took the pen and signed her name with steady strokes. The ink seemed to seal her fate, or so it appeared. There's something you should know, Elena said, handing back the clipboard. What? Robert snapped. Elena's voice didn't shake. You didn't just evict me. She stepped closer, just enough for only him to hear. You evicted yourself. Robert frowned. What are you talking about? Elena lifted her suitcase. Check the deed. She walked toward the door, her heels clicking against the marble. At the threshold, she paused without turning around. And don't use your company card today. Robert's hand went instinctively to his wallet. Elena, what the hell? But she was already outside, walking past the neighbor behind the rose bushes who was still recording. Instead of hiding her face, Elena looked directly into the camera. Enjoy the afternoon, she said clearly, her voice carrying across the lawn. It's the last calm one you'll get. As her Uber pulled away, Elena caught sight of Robert in the doorway, staring at his phone like it had betrayed him. Through the rear window, she watched his confident posture begin to crumble. Elena didn't look back. Because the moment Robert opened the deed, everything would change. He wouldn't be her husband anymore. He'd be a trespasser. The first domino was about to fall, and Elena Vasquez had been positioning the others for 3 years. Ever since she'd found Stephanie's lipstick in their bedroom, she'd been playing the longest, most devastating game of chess in corporate history. Robert thought he'd just won. He had no idea the game had only just begun. Elena's Uber pulled away from Willowbrook Estates as Robert frantically tapped his phone screen in the doorway. She'd given him 2 simple instructions: check the deed, don't use the company card. She wondered which one he'd ignore first. The driver glanced in the rearview mirror. Rough day. The best day I've had in 3 years, Elena replied, surprising herself with the truth in those words. 20 minutes later, she sat across from David Hale in his downtown law office, the same office where she'd first learned the power of invisible ownership. David had been her grandmother's estate attorney before becoming hers, and he understood the art of legal protection better than anyone. How did it go? David asked, pouring coffee from an expensive machine Elena had helped him select last Christmas. Exactly as we planned. Elena accepted the cup gratefully. He signed the eviction papers without reading them. 30 years in business, and he still doesn't read what he signs. And Stephanie? Already moved in. I could hear her in the kitchen, probably planning her nursery in my old office. Elena's voice remained steady, but David caught the flash of pain in her eyes. Elena, you know you could have stopped this months ago. The moment we discovered the affair.
No.
Elena's interruption was sharp. He needed to show everyone exactly who he really is. The neighbors, the staff, the business community. They all needed to see him throw away 15 years of marriage like it meant nothing. David leaned back in his leather chair. Tell me again why you started the investigation. Elena stared out the window at the city skyline, remembering the night that changed everything. 3 years ago, I found the affair. And when I looked closer, I found something worse. He'd been using company money and my name like they belonged to him. The investigator found concrete evidence. He put her rent on a corporate card. Elena's hands tightened around her coffee cup. David, I was legally responsible for debt I never authorized. That's when you started moving assets to the family trust. Elena smiled for the first time since leaving the house. Grandmother always said a smart woman never lets a man control what she can't afford to lose. She survived 3 market crashes by keeping everything in a trust structure her husband couldn't control. Your grandmother was ahead of her time. She was protecting her family. Elena's phone buzzed with a text message. She glanced at it, and her smile widened. Right on schedule. Meanwhile, back at the mansion, Robert stood in his study with the deed to 1247 Willowbrook Drive spread across his mahogany desk. The document was 12 pages long, dense with legal language he'd never bothered to read when they'd purchased the property 8 years ago. He'd signed where Elena pointed, trusted her to handle the details. She'd always been better with paperwork. Now, scanning the ownership clauses, Robert felt his confidence evaporating. The primary owner wasn't listed as Robert and Elena Vasquez, as he'd assumed. The property was owned by the Vasquez Family Trust, established in 2016. Trustee and beneficial owner, Elena Carmen Vasquez. That's impossible, Robert muttered, pulling up the county records on his laptop. They bought it together. Then, during a refinance, the deed moved into the family trust, with his signature on the paperwork. Documents he now realized he'd signed without reading, trusting Elena to handle what he'd assumed were routine refinancing papers. Robert. Stephanie's voice called from the kitchen. The movers are here with my furniture. Where do you want them to put the crib? Robert stared at the computer screen, his mouth dry. If Elena owned the house through her trust, then the eviction papers he'd just served her were legally meaningless. Worse, she could have him and Stephanie removed immediately. His phone buzzed. Elena's number. You're reading the deed. Elena's voice was calm. Elena, what the hell is this? The trust, the ownership. I told you not to sign what you don't read. Elena's tone remained maddeningly reasonable. Check your card. The line went dead. Robert opened the banking app on his phone. Account closed flashed across the screen in red letters. He tried to process a routine vendor payment on his laptop, declined. From upstairs, he could hear Stephanie directing the movers, her excited voice echoing through the halls as she planned their future in a house that wasn't his to give. His laptop chimed with an email from Vastec's chief financial officer. Emergency board meeting tomorrow, 9 a.m. Please review attached documents before attending. Robert opened the attachment. Agenda Item 1. Removal for cause. Agenda Item 2. Freezing executive access.
His throat went dry.
Because the meeting tomorrow wasn't to review documents. It was to erase him. In her lawyer's office, Elena watched David make notes on a legal pad. The credit card was the easy part, she said. The emergency board meeting is called for 9 a.m. The investigator hand-delivered the evidence to each board member this afternoon. David looked up from his notes. Elena, you know this will destroy him completely. He destroyed us first. Elena stood and walked to the window, looking out at the city where she'd built her career, where she'd met Robert in graduate school, where they dreamed of building something lasting together. 15 years, David. 15 years of marriage, and he threw me away for a 24-year-old who probably doesn't even know his middle name. Do you want him to suffer, or do you want justice? Elena turned back to face her lawyer, and David saw something in her eyes he'd never seen before. Not anger, not hurt, but an absolute, unshakable resolve. I want the truth, she said simply. And I want everyone to see exactly who Robert Vasquez really is. Back at the mansion, Robert sat in his study surrounded by documents he was finally reading too late. Property deeds, corporate bylaws, loan agreements, all bearing his signature, all authorizing Elena to act in ways he never understood. Tomorrow morning, the board of directors would see 3 years of evidence. Financial misconduct, unauthorized personal expenses, forged signatures on loan documents. And Elena Vasquez, the woman he'd just humiliated and evicted, would be sitting at that table as the majority shareholder he'd somehow forgotten she'd become. Robert sat outside Vastec's headquarters with his hands shaking on the steering wheel. Elena wasn't answering. And for the first time, he felt what it was like to be locked out. Inside the Vastec boardroom, Elena arrived precisely at 8:45. She wore her navy blue suit, the one she'd bought to celebrate the company's first million in revenue, back when she and Robert were partners in every sense of the word. The 7 board members were already seated around the polished conference table, each with a thick folder marked "Confidential" at their place. Elena took her seat at the head of the table, where she'd sat as Chief Technology Officer for the past 8 years, where Robert assumed he would sit as CEO. Good morning, Elena said simply. Thank you all for making time on short notice. Board Chairman Frank Callahan, a veteran tech executive who'd mentored Elena since her startup days, nodded grimly. Elena, I've reviewed the materials you provided. If even half of this is accurate, it's all accurate. Elena opened her own folder, revealing months of documented evidence. Bank statements, expense reports, forged authorization forms. Everything is verified and legally admissible. Robert burst through the boardroom doors, still wearing yesterday's clothes, his usually perfect hair disheveled. What the hell is this? Elena, you can't just... He stopped mid-sentence when he saw the board members' faces. No one met his eyes. No one stood to greet him. His usual chair, the CEO's chair, had been moved to the far end of the table. Please sit down, Robert, Frank Callahan said quietly. Robert remained standing. This is my company. I built Vastec from nothing. You built it with Elena's technology patents, Callahan replied, consulting his folder. Elena's holding company controls the voting shares because the patents were assigned there years ago. The same year you took out unauthorized loans using those patents as collateral. Elena watched Robert's face cycle through confusion, anger, and dawning horror. She felt no satisfaction in his pain, only the cold relief of finally telling the truth. Which makes her, effectively, your boss, Callahan continued. And she's brought credible evidence of financial misconduct to this board. Robert turned to Elena, his voice breaking. Elena, please. We can work this out. Stephanie's rent isn't a mistake. Elena's voice was calm, professional. Her car payments aren't a mistake. She stood and walked to the presentation screen, clicking through slides she'd prepared with the methodical precision of a prosecutor. Company credit card charged $2,400 for jewelry at Tiffany's. The receipt shows it was for a pregnancy announcement gift. $8,500 charged to office furniture that was delivered to Stephanie's apartment. $47,000 in consulting fees to her photography business for work that was never delivered. With each slide, Robert seemed to shrink further into himself. Elena, she was pregnant. She needed She needed support from the father of her child. Elena interrupted, her voice sharp for the first time. Not theft from the company that employed him. Callahan cleared his throat. Robert, do you dispute any of these charges? Robert looked around the room at faces that had once welcomed him warmly. Now they watched him like strangers. This is retaliation, Robert said desperately. You can't do this. Elena met his eyes for the first time all morning. Watch me. The silence in the room was deafening. Callahan opened a legal document. Robert Vasquez, the board of directors votes to immediately terminate your employment as chief executive officer of Vastech Industries, effective immediately. Robert's legs gave out. He collapsed into the distant chair, staring at Elena with a mixture of betrayal and desperation. All in favor? Callahan asked. 7 hands raised in unison. As if summoned by his defeat, Robert's phone rang. Stephanie's ringtone, a cheerful melody that now sounded like mockery. Robert answered with shaking hands. Steph, I can't talk right now. Robert, there are men at the house. Stephanie's voice was high and panicked, loud enough for the entire boardroom to hear. They have papers. They say we have to leave today. Elena had timed everything perfectly. While Robert was learning about his termination, the sheriff's department was executing the property reclamation order. Robert, what's happening? Stephanie continued. They're saying the house isn't ours? That we're trespassing. Robert looked up at Elena and realized the meeting wasn't the worst part. The worst part was happening at his front door. 20 minutes later, Robert stood on the front lawn of 1247 Willowbrook Drive, watching sheriffs carry out furniture while neighbors recorded everything from their windows. Stephanie sat on the marble steps, crying into her hands while boxes of her belongings piled up on the driveway. Robert, I don't understand, she kept saying. Yesterday you said this was our house. You said we'd raise the baby here. Robert knelt beside her, his expensive suit grass-stained and wrinkled. Around them, the neighborhood that had welcomed them yesterday now felt like a gallery of judgment. Mrs. Patterson from across the street had her phone out. The Hendersons were whispering behind their fence. We'll figure this out, Robert said, but even he could hear how hollow the words sounded. With what money? Stephanie's voice cracked. They took your job, Robert. And apparently this was never even your house. Robert's phone buzzed constantly with notifications. Text messages from colleagues. Missed calls from vendors. LinkedIn notifications that made his stomach turn. People were already updating their profiles to remove any association with Vastech. A sheriff approached with a clipboard. Sir, we need you to sign acknowledging that all personal property has been removed from the premises. Robert scanned the document, then looked back at the house Elena had somehow owned all along. What happens if I don't sign? Then you'll be arrested for trespassing. Robert signed. As the sheriff's vehicles pulled away, a man in a suit approached them. Robert Vasquez? You've been served. He handed Robert an envelope. The header read, Notice of Investigation. Your former company has reported irregularities tied to your expense approvals, the man said. You'll be contacted by investigators. Do not destroy records. Robert stared at the official seal on the documents. State Regulatory Board. Financial Misconduct Inquiry. Potential criminal charges. Robert, what is he talking about? Stephanie's voice was barely a whisper. But Robert couldn't answer because his phone was ringing. His lawyer. Robert, don't say anything to anyone, came the urgent voice through the speaker. Vastech is outside. Counsel has opened an internal investigation. They're claiming you used company funds for personal expenses. This is serious. Stephanie stood slowly, backing away from Robert. I'm leaving, Robert. Stephanie, wait. For what? She turned to face him, and for the first time since he'd known her, she looked older than her 24 years. You told me you owned a tech company. You told me you owned this house. What else was a lie? She walked away without looking back, wheeling her suitcase toward the street where an Uber was already waiting. Robert stood alone on the lawn, surrounded by the wreckage of the life he'd thought was his. His phone continued buzzing with calls he couldn't afford to answer and messages he was afraid to read. By evening, the news vans had arrived. Robert watched from his car as reporters set up on the sidewalk outside what had been his home that morning. A blonde journalist he recognized from the local news was speaking into a camera. Behind me is the million-dollar estate at the center of a shocking tech industry scandal. Vastech CEO Robert Vasquez was terminated today following allegations of financial misconduct, and sources tell us the FBI may be involved. Robert's phone rang. Unknown number. Mr. Vasquez? This is Natalie Brooks from the business desk. We're running a story about the Vastech investigation and wondering if you'd be willing to comment on the allegations against you. No comment, Robert said and hung up. But the calls kept coming. Industry publications. Online newsletters. Former employees eager to share their own stories. By the time Robert checked into a budget motel on the outskirts of town, his voice mailbox was full and his reputation was being dissected on social media. He scrolled through the comment sections, watching 15 years of professional relationships evaporate in real time. Former partners distancing themselves. Clients expressing concern. Competitors circling like vultures. Everyone wanted to be on the winning side. And Elena was definitely winning. Robert sat on the edge of the motel bed, staring at his phone. He had less than $3,000 in his personal checking account. His company cards were frozen. His lawyer was demanding a retainer he couldn't afford. Stephanie was probably halfway to Portland by now. But Elena, the woman who'd shared his bed for 15 years, who'd celebrated every success and weathered every failure beside him, had systematically destroyed his entire existence with the precision of a surgeon removing a tumor. Robert opened his phone and typed a message to Elena. This isn't over. Not a threat of violence. A promise of war, lawyers, headlines, and revenge dressed up as justice. He stared at the text for a long moment, his thumb hovering over the send button. Then he pressed it. Across town, Elena sat in her temporary apartment reading the message. She didn't flinch. She simply forwarded it to David and typed 3 words. Save everything.
Now.
Then she opened a new folder on her laptop and labeled it Retaliation. Because men like Robert never apologized when they lost. They escalated. And this time, Elena was ready for that too. 3 days later, Elena sat in Graham Pierce's office reviewing the morning news coverage when her phone rang. Unknown number, which usually meant another reporter. Ms. Vasquez? This is Patricia Sloan from Kellerman and Associates. I represent Robert Vasquez in his response to recent legal actions. Elena felt her stomach tighten. Robert had found a lawyer fast. I have counsel, Ms. Sloan. Yes, Graham Pierce. We'll be in touch with him shortly. But I wanted to speak with you directly about some documents my client discovered during his records review. What documents? Trust formation papers from 2016. Corporate restructuring from 2018. And some very interesting email correspondence between you and your financial advisor starting in 2017. Elena's blood ran cold. I don't know what you're talking about. Ms. Vasquez, my client has evidence that you began moving marital assets into protected structures 2 years before you claim to have discovered his affair. That raises some interesting questions about asset concealment in anticipation of divorce. The line went dead. Elena stared at her phone, her hands shaking. She'd been so careful, so methodical. But Robert had access to their shared email accounts until she'd changed the passwords 3 days ago. If he'd downloaded everything before the lockout. Graham, Elena called out. We have a problem. Graham looked up from his laptop. What kind of problem? The kind where Robert's new lawyer just threatened to prove I was planning this divorce before I found the affair. That's impossible. You didn't start moving assets until after you discovered Stephanie. Elena's silence stretched too long. Elena? Graham's voice was carefully controlled. You didn't start moving assets until after the affair, right? I started the trust in 2016 to protect my grandmother's inheritance, Elena said quietly. That's legitimate estate planning. And the corporate restructuring in 2018? Elena stood and walked to the window, no longer able to meet Graham's eyes. Robert was making reckless investments. The cryptocurrency speculation, the real estate leverage. I needed to protect our core assets. Elena, that was before the affair. It was before I discovered the affair. Elena's voice was barely a whisper. But I suspected something was wrong. He was distant, secretive about his phone, working late constantly. I hired a private investigator in early 2018 to confirm what I already knew. Elena turned back to face Graham. I didn't plan divorce. I planned survival. Graham closed his laptop slowly. Elena, you've been lying to me for 3 years? I've been protecting myself. Elena's voice grew stronger. And I was right too. Everything we discovered about his financial misconduct, his affair, his lies, I was right about all of it. But if you were moving assets in anticipation of divorce, then Robert has grounds to challenge everything. The trust, the property transfers, even your voting control of Vastec. Elena's phone buzzed with an email from Patricia Sloan. The subject line read, "Formal discovery request." Elena opened the attachment and felt the room spin. A thick discovery request demanding bank records, email correspondence, private investigator reports, trust formation documents, every text message and phone call from the past 5 years. And at the bottom, a motion to freeze all asset transfers pending a full forensic accounting. Graham, how long would a legal challenge take? If Robert can prove you moved assets in anticipation of divorce without his knowledge? Months, maybe years. And Elena, if the court finds that you deliberately concealed assets?
What?
You could lose control. And the court could unwind transfers, freeze accounts, and sanction you hard. Elena's carefully constructed revenge was unraveling in real time. Across town, Robert sat in Patricia Sloan's office with documents spread across a conference table that he'd paid for with his last functioning credit card. The lawyer was young, hungry, and working on contingency, exactly what he needed. The timeline is clear, Patricia explained. Your wife began asset protection measures 15 months before she claims to have discovered your affair. The private investigator was hired in February 2018. But according to her statement to the Vastec board, she didn't find evidence of infidelity until March 2019. Robert stared at the email printouts Elena had sent to her financial advisor. She was planning to divorce me before she even knew about Stephanie. More than that, she was planning to destroy you. Patricia highlighted a particular email dated December 2018. Quote, "We need to ensure that when this marriage ends, I maintain control of all IP and voting shares." Robert's pattern of financial recklessness makes him a liability to the company's future. Robert felt something between vindication and devastation. She was setting me up. She was preparing for war. The question is, do you want to fight back? Robert thought about the past 3 days. Sleeping in a motel. Eating fast food because he couldn't afford restaurants. Watching his career become a cautionary tale in business journals. Stephanie's silence from Portland. What can we do? Patricia smiled. Elena Vasquez has been very clever. But she made one critical mistake. Which is, she used marital funds to pay for her private investigator, her lawyer fees, and her asset protection planning. If we show you used marital money to set up transfers designed to leave him with nothing, a judge can freeze everything and force a full accounting. Robert felt hope for the first time in days. Can we win? Robert, your wife is brilliant. But she got so focused on destroying you legally that she forgot to cover her tracks personally. Patricia gathered the documents. She documented everything. Every conversation with lawyers, every strategic decision, every step of her plan. And she used joint marital funds to pay for all of it. Robert's phone buzzed with a news alert. Key client pauses contract amid Vastec ownership dispute. The business community was already reacting to rumors of the legal challenge. Elena's carefully orchestrated victory was turning into a public relations nightmare. Patricia, how long until we can file? I'll have the motion ready by tomorrow morning. But Robert, you need to understand, this is going to get ugly. Your wife has been planning this for years. She won't give up easily. Robert thought about Elena's text message. This isn't over. She'd been right about that. But she'd underestimated how ruthless he'd become when lawyers told him he had a chance. File the motion, Robert said. Meanwhile, back in Graham's office, Elena stared at the motion to freeze transfers. For the first time since the eviction, her hands shook. Not from fear, from calculation. Graham, she said, voice low. We don't fight this with emotion. She opened the envelope she'd taken from the safe and slid out one document she hadn't shown anyone yet. We end it. Graham stared at the folder Elena placed on his desk. Elena, where did this come from? The safe, she said quietly. The one he thought I didn't know the combination to. Inside were signed vendor authorizations, falsified board minutes, and a single email printed and highlighted, Robert's words, in his own writing, sent to their chief financial officer. Move Stephanie's expenses through the consulting line item. She'll never notice if we spread it across quarters. If anyone asks, call it retention consulting. Elena trusts me to handle vendor relationships. Graham exhaled slowly. This isn't just civil misconduct anymore. Elena nodded. I know. If we file this, it's not just asset recovery. This becomes a criminal referral for wire fraud and conspiracy. Graham read the email again. Elena, this would destroy him completely. Prison time, felony conviction, permanent professional ban. Elena stared out the window at the city, where she'd built her reputation on integrity and careful, methodical work. And if I don't file it, his legal challenge could succeed. The judge might rule that your asset protection was improper, unwind the transfers, and leave you with nothing while he walks away claiming he was the victim of a vindictive wife. Meanwhile, across town, Robert sat in Patricia's office as she prepared for the emergency status conference the court had scheduled. The judge wants to review whatever Elena's team submitted before allowing us to proceed with discovery, Patricia explained. That usually means they have something significant. Robert felt his momentary hope wavering. What could Elena possibly have that would stop our case? I don't know. But Judge Kendrick doesn't call emergency conferences unless there's new evidence that changes everything. Patricia gathered her files. Robert, I need to ask again. Is there anything Elena might have access to? Any documents, emails, recordings that could hurt us? Robert thought about the communications he'd had with the CFO about Stephanie's expenses. The way he'd justified the charges in writing. The authorizations he'd signed using Elena's name, without her knowledge. Robert. Patricia's voice seemed to come from far away. What aren't you telling me? I may have documented some of the expense decisions in emails. What kind of documentation? Robert couldn't meet her eyes. Instructions to accounting. How to categorize certain charges. The silence in the room was deafening. Robert, if Elena has internal emails showing you knowingly falsified company records, she shouldn't have access to those. They were on the company server, and she lost access when I had IT change her passwords. Patricia's expression grew increasingly grim. Robert, did you ever discuss these instructions in writing? Did you ever reference Elena specifically? Robert's mouth went dry as he remembered the exact words he'd typed. Elena trusts me to handle vendor relationships. If Elena somehow obtained internal company communications and can prove you were deliberately concealing expenses from her while using her name to authorize them. Robert didn't need her to finish the sentence. Any prosecutor reviewing evidence of documented fraud conspiracy would have enough for criminal charges. His phone buzzed with a text from Stephanie. I can't keep pretending this will work out. I'm staying in Portland. Robert stared at the message. Stephanie was gone permanently now. His career was gone. His home was gone. And Elena was about to reveal evidence that could send him to prison. He thought the board meeting was his lowest point. He'd been wrong. Back in Graham's office, Elena sat with the criminal evidence spread in front of her, feeling the weight of another person's future in her hands. If I file this, I don't just win our civil case, she said quietly. I destroy his life forever. Elena, he didn't extend you the same consideration.
No.
But fraud charges mean prison time. It means he'll never work again anywhere. It means when he's 60 years old, he'll still be explaining this to potential employers who will never hire him. Graham leaned forward. Elena, if you don't use this evidence, there's a real chance you could lose everything. Robert's challenge is solid. You moved assets before disclosing the investigation. A sympathetic judge might rule in his favor. I could lose the house, the company control, even face court sanctions. Yes. Elena stood and walked to Graham's computer, where the court filing system was already open. One click would submit the evidence that would guarantee her total victory. Graham, what kind of person destroys someone completely just to avoid the possibility of losing? The kind of person who survives. Elena stared at the screen. Her cursor hovered over the File with Court button. Would I survive? Or would I become exactly the kind of person who ruins lives to protect their own interests? She looked down at the evidence that could guarantee her victory and realized she'd been asking the wrong question all along. It wasn't whether she could win by using this evidence. It was whether she could live with herself after winning this way. Elena, Graham said quietly, once the status conference happens, there's no going back. If Judge Kendrick rules against the evidence submission, Robert's challenge moves forward and you could lose everything you've worked for. Elena's finger hovered over the mouse. Because she'd just realized the terrible truth about revenge. The moment you were willing to destroy someone's entire future to protect your own, you'd crossed a line you could never uncross. The question was whether she was strong enough to choose uncertainty over becoming the kind of person who crushes people who are already down, even if it meant risking everything. Graham's voice was quiet. If you file this, there's no going back. Elena stared at the screen, and then she clicked send. The email confirmation appeared on Graham's screen. Filing submitted successfully. Case #CV 2024-8847. Elena stared at the message, feeling something cold settle in her stomach. It's done. Elena, you made the right choice. The evidence shows systematic forgery and embezzlement. Robert used your signature on bank documents, falsified board authorizations. Graham. Elena's voice was quiet. I need a moment. She walked to the window, unable to sit still. Outside, the city continued its daily rhythm, oblivious to the fact that she'd just set in motion the complete destruction of a man she'd once loved enough to marry.
Her phone rang.
The caller ID showed a number she hadn't seen in months. Her sister Maria, calling from Phoenix. Elena? I just saw the news. Online they're saying the board referred the case to regulators. Elena, what's happening? Elena pressed the phone to her ear. Robert forged signatures, Maria. He embezzled company funds using my name as authorization. This isn't just about the affair. Jesus, Elena. But you're turning this into a public execution. You don't understand what he did. I understand that 15 years ago you called me crying because Robert proposed. You said he was the kindest man you'd ever met. You said he made you believe in forever. Maria's voice carried genuine concern. What happened to that woman? Elena stared at her reflection in the window. That woman trusted someone who stole from her for months. Elena, I know he hurt you. I know the betrayal was devastating. But this level of revenge. Maria paused. This doesn't sound like the sister I know. Maybe you don't know who I really am. Maybe you don't either. The line went quiet. Elena, when this is over, when he's destroyed and you've won everything, who are you going to be then? Elena ended the call without answering, because she was starting to understand that winning and surviving weren't the same thing. 20 minutes later, Elena sat alone in Graham's conference room, scrolling through the immediate media response. The headlines were brutal. Tech executive faces fraud investigation in marriage scandal. Wife's evidence. How financial betrayal became criminal case. Vast tech board refers CEO to authorities. The comments were worse. Hundreds of people treating Robert's downfall like entertainment, calling her a hero for destroying her cheating husband. Social media was celebrating his humiliation. Elena's phone buzzed with messages from strangers. You're my hero. This is how you handle cheaters. Finally, a woman who fights back properly. She stared at the messages, realizing she'd become a symbol for something she'd never intended to represent. This wasn't about justice anymore. It was feeding a public appetite for revenge. Graham came back in, eyes tight. They're asking for one thing, Elena. What? He slid a document across the table. Sworn declaration. If you sign this, Graham said, it forces the company to formally notify regulators. It locks the evidence into the record. It ends Robert's civil challenge permanently. But it also guarantees this won't stay private. Elena stared at the signature line. The declaration detailed every forged signature, every falsified authorization, every unauthorized transfer Robert had made using her identity. Signing it would make his criminal exposure unavoidable. "And if I don't," she asked, "then we keep fighting in civil court. Longer. Dirtier. He'll leak information about your asset transfers. He'll try to make you look vindictive. He'll drag this out for years and try to claw back control of everything." Elena thought about Robert across town, probably sitting in Patricia's office, still believing he could somehow salvage his life from the wreckage of the past week. She thought about Stephanie, already building a new life in Portland without either of them. She thought about the neighbors who'd filmed her eviction, the board members who'd voted to terminate Robert, the business community that was already choosing sides. "Elena," Graham said quietly, "this declaration doesn't just finish Robert's legal challenge. It finishes Robert.
Completely.
Permanently." Elena's phone buzzed again. Another message calling her a hero, another stranger cheering for blood. She looked at the pen in her hand. This was never supposed to be entertainment. Graham's voice softened.
No.
It was supposed to be protection. Elena picked up the pen and held it over the signature line. Maria's words echoed in her head. "When this is over, when he's destroyed and you've won everything, who are you going to be then?" Elena realized the impossible choice wasn't really about Robert's future. It was about who she wanted to be when she won. She looked at the document one more time. Every detail was accurate. Every charge was justified. Robert had systematically betrayed her trust, stolen from their company, and used her identity to authorize his own fraud. He'd made these choices. She was just deciding whether to document them officially. Elena signed her name with steady strokes. The declaration was complete. The evidence was locked into the legal record. Robert's criminal exposure was now unavoidable. And Elena Vasquez had officially become the woman who chose total victory over mercy. She set down the pen and realized she felt nothing at all, which might have been the most frightening thing of all. The regulatory investigation moved with the efficiency Elena had expected and the brutality she hadn't prepared for. Within 48 hours of Elena's signed declaration, state investigators seized Vasteca's financial records. Within 72 hours, Robert's personal and business accounts were frozen pending a full audit. By the end of the week, local news stations were running daily updates on the Vastec scandal. Graham called Friday morning with news that changed everything. The investigators found additional evidence, Elena. Robert's signature forgery goes back 3 years, not just the Stephanie expenses. He'd been authorizing payments to shell companies he created, then funneling money back to himself. How much? Over $400,000. Elena set down her coffee cup carefully. 400,000? There's more. They found evidence that Robert approached 2 competitors about selling Vasteca's proprietary technology. Without board approval. Without your consent as IP holder. Graham's voice was grim. Elena, he was planning to drain the accounts and leave you liable for everything. Elena felt the last traces of doubt about her actions evaporate. Robert hadn't just cheated on her. He'd been systematically planning to steal her life's work and disappear. "Graham, when do we get the house back?" The judge signed the writ of possession this morning. The sheriffs are executing it now. Across town, Stephanie sat in the mansion's kitchen, scrolling through apartment listings on her laptop while boxes of baby furniture crowded the marble countertops. She'd been there for 8 days, but it already felt like home.
The doorbell rang.
Stephanie opened the front door to find 3 sheriff's deputies holding official documents. "Ma'am, we have a writ of possession for this property. You need to vacate the premises immediately." Stephanie's face went white. "There must be a mistake," Robert said. "Ma'am, Robert Vasquez has no legal authority over this property. You have 30 minutes to collect personal belongings." "But I live here. My baby's nursery is upstairs." The senior deputy consulted his paperwork. "According to the court order, you're considered an unauthorized occupant. Any belongings not removed in 30 minutes become abandoned property." Stephanie called Robert frantically, but his phone went straight to voicemail. The investigators had confiscated it as evidence. 25 minutes later, Stephanie stood on the same lawn where Elena had been humiliated 8 days earlier, watching movers load her furniture into trucks while neighbors filmed everything. The irony wasn't lost on anyone present. Mrs. Patterson from across the street called out, "Stephanie, honey, do you need somewhere to stay?" But Stephanie was already calling her sister in Portland, tears streaming down her face, as she realized Robert's promises had been as worthless as his marriage vows. Meanwhile, Elena sat in the downtown courthouse where Robert was meeting with investigators. She told Graham she was there to finalize property transfers, but she realized she needed to see Robert one last time. Robert stepped out of the elevator and froze when he saw her. "Elena," he said, his voice hoarse. "I read the investigator's summary," Elena replied. "The forgeries. The attempted sale of my patents." Robert's shoulders sagged. "I did it." "Why?" Robert's eyes flicked away. "Because I thought I could." Elena nodded once, like a judge delivering a sentence. "Then you can live with it." His lawyer stepped between them. "We're done here." Elena didn't argue. She didn't need to. She walked away because the court would finish what she'd started. An hour later, Elena stood in the driveway of 1247 Willowbrook Drive, holding the keys the sheriff had just returned to her. The house looked exactly the same as the day she'd been forced to leave, but everything felt different. Graham approached with the final court documents. "It's official. Full property control restored. The board voted unanimously to confirm your permanent CEO appointment, and Robert's civil challenge has been dismissed with prejudice." Elena looked up at the mansion she designed, decorated, and protected. The home where she'd believed in forever, where she'd planned a future with someone who'd been planning to steal it from her. "Graham, how do you think this will end?" "Robert will likely serve 2 to 4 years. Financial crimes. First offense. When he gets out, he'll be permanently barred from corporate leadership and face significant restitution obligations." Elena nodded. "And Stephanie?" "Already back in Portland. Word is she's filing for welfare assistance and pursuing child support through the courts, though Robert's assets are frozen indefinitely." Elena felt something she hadn't expected, not satisfaction, but exhaustion. The kind that came from fighting a war she'd never wanted to fight. "Elena, you won," Graham said quietly. "Everything. The house, the company, your reputation. Robert lost everything. Isn't that what you wanted?" Elena looked around the neighborhood where she'd lived for 8 years, where she'd dreamed of raising children with Robert, where she'd learned that the person sleeping beside you could be a complete stranger. "Graham, I wanted my husband not to steal from me. I wanted my marriage not to be a lie." Elena's voice was steady but tired. "What I won was proof that I was right to protect myself." She turned toward the house, then stopped. "It doesn't feel like revenge. It feels like the end of a hostage situation." Elena walked up the marble steps where Stephanie had sat crying that morning, where Robert had served her eviction papers 8 days ago, where she'd made the choice to stop being a victim. She put her key in the lock, her lock on her door, to her house, and stepped inside. The clerk stamped the final order. Writ granted. Elena exhaled once and said to no one in particular, "I want my life back." And for the first time in 3 years, she meant her own life. Not Robert's destruction. Not Stephanie's humiliation. Not the business community's validation. Just the simple, radical act of building something new from the ashes of everything she'd had to burn down to survive. 6 months later, Elena stood in the vast tech boardroom, looking out at the same city skyline she'd stared at during the darkest moments of her marriage. But everything was different now. The company had thrived under her leadership. Without Robert's reckless spending and unauthorized deals, Vast Tech had become profitable for the first time in 3 years. Elena had hired 2 new engineers, launched the product line she'd been developing before the crisis, and secured 3 major contracts that would sustain them for years. "The quarterly numbers are exceptional," the board chair reported. "Elena, your strategic vision has transformed this company." Elena nodded, accepting the praise she'd earned through months of 18-hour days and careful rebuilding. But success felt different now, less like validation, more like simple competence rewarded. After the meeting, Elena sat alone in her office, reading the final update from the criminal case. Robert had accepted a plea agreement, a prison sentence, probation, and full restitution of the stolen funds. He'd serve his time quietly and disappear from the tech industry forever. Stephanie had the baby. Robert wasn't in the picture anymore. Elena felt nothing but relief at that news. Whatever pain Stephanie had caused, no child deserved to carry the burden of the story. Elena's phone rang. Maria, calling from Phoenix, as she did every Sunday now. "How are you holding up, Elena?" "I'm good. Really good, actually." Elena meant it. "The company's stable, the legal issues are resolved, and I'm sleeping better than I have in years." And, personally? Elena considered the question. She'd been asked on 3 dates in the past month, colleagues, friends of friends, a neighbor who'd watched her rebuild her life with obvious admiration. She'd declined them all, not from lingering pain, but from genuine disinterest. "Maria, I think I'm learning how to be alone without being lonely." "That's healthy. But Elena, don't let what Robert did close you off to the possibility of finding something real." Elena walked to her office window, looking down at the city where she'd once believed in forever. "Maria, I did find something real. I found myself." "That's beautiful, but you know what I mean." "I know. And maybe someday." Elena smiled. "But right now, I'm building something that's entirely mine. And for the first time since I was 25, I'm not building it for anyone else." After hanging up, Elena gathered her things and headed home. Home to the house that was indisputably hers, where every decision reflected her taste alone, where she'd slowly replaced everything that reminded her of the life she'd thought she wanted. The kitchen had been remodeled, the master bedroom redecorated. The office where she discovered Robert's first lies had been converted into an art studio where she painted on weekends, something she'd abandoned during her marriage but rediscovered during her recovery. Elena's phone buzzed with an email from the prosecutor's office as she pulled into her driveway. The subject line read, "Thank you, and request for case study permission." She read it while sitting in her car. "Ms. Vasquez, your documentation and handling of financial fraud has become a model for our office. We've had 12 other women come forward in the past 3 months with similar situations, and your case gave them the roadmap to protect themselves legally. Would you permit us to use elements of your case as a training example?" Elena felt something shift inside her chest. She thought about the anonymous messages she'd received months ago, strangers calling her a hero, celebrating Robert's destruction. But this felt different. This wasn't about revenge or entertainment. This was about protection. About showing people that they didn't have to accept financial abuse, that they could document it, report it, and rebuild from it. Elena typed back, "Yes. If it helps other people protect themselves, use whatever you need." She walked up the marble steps where her story had begun with humiliation and eviction. She put her key in the lock, the same lock, but everything else transformed, and stepped inside. The house was quiet, peaceful, entirely hers. On the kitchen counter sat the Sunday paper, folded open to the business section where Vasteca's success story was featured prominently. Local tech company thrives under new leadership. Elena made herself dinner, something she'd never had time for during her marriage, and ate it at the kitchen table where she and Robert had once planned their future over morning coffee. She didn't miss him. She missed the person she'd been when she believed in him, more trusting, more hopeful, more willing to see the best in people. But she didn't want to be that naive again, even if it had felt safer then. As evening settled over the neighborhood, Elena walked through her house, turning on lights in rooms that had once echoed with laughter and arguments and promises that meant nothing. Now they echoed with the quiet she'd earned. Elena settled into her reading chair, new furniture, chosen entirely by her, and opened a book she'd been wanting to read for months. Something she'd never had time for when her life revolved around managing someone else's chaos. Her phone buzzed with a text from Graham. "Elena, got a call from a journalist. They want to do a feature story about your case. Interested?" Elena typed back quickly. No thanks. The story's over.
Because it was.
Not the fairy tale ending she'd once dreamed of, where love conquered all and marriage meant security and partnership meant never having to protect yourself from the person who promised to protect you. But the ending she'd earned: competence, independence, and the hard-won knowledge that she could build something beautiful from the ashes of everything she'd had to burn down to survive. Elena turned the page of her book and settled deeper into her chair. Outside, the neighborhood settled into its Sunday evening rhythm. Inside, Elena Vasquez, CEO, survivor, architect of her own future, read quietly in her home. The eviction notice was framed in her office, not as a trophy, but as a reminder. The moment her real life began was the moment she stopped letting anyone else write the ending. Elena turned another page and smiled. Because for the first time in 15 years, she was exactly where she belonged. What did this story teach you about protecting yourself while maintaining your integrity? Drop your thoughts in the comments and subscribe for more stories that will change how you see the world.